In Maplewood's elite circles, wedding planner Victoria Sterling was about to face her reckoning. What started as an exclusive society wedding took a shocking turn when the honor guard marched in. Victoria wasn't your typical coordinator. For 15 years, she'd built her reputation erasing anything beneath her standards. When she stripped military traditions from the Henderson family's celebration, she had no idea she was walking into public humiliation. Victoria's prejudice against the wounded veteran father would lead to her complete downfall. What began as control would become destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Sterling adjusted the fresh orchids on her mahogany desk, their pristine white petals catching the morning light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Maplewood office. Everything had to be perfect. It always did. The crystal paperweight, positioned precisely 3 inches from her Mont Blanc pen, the leather portfolio, angled just so. The silver picture frame, displaying her latest feature in Luxury Weddings Quarterly, where she smiled beside a bride whose family had old money written in every line of their designer clothing. The Henderson family was scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock sharp. Victoria had already reviewed their initial inquiry twice, her manicured fingers drumming against the desk as she'd read through their modest budget and requests for military traditions. The number alone had made her consider declining the consultation. She could earn 3 times as much planning a weekend for the Ashworth family or the Pemberton estate. But business had been slower this month, and even Victoria Sterling had bills to pay. The soft chime of her reception area's door announced their arrival. Victoria straightened in her chair, smoothing the fabric of her cream-colored St. John suit, the one that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Through her glass office door, she watched them enter. The first thing she noticed was the man's slight limp, the way he favored his left leg as he walked, military bearing still evident despite the careful gait. Behind him, a woman with graying brown hair swept back in a practical style that spoke of someone who'd learned to make the best of rushed mornings and frequent relocations. The young couple followed, the bride-to-be, Sarah, with warm brown eyes and an eager smile, and her fiancé in a pressed shirt that was clean but not custom-tailored. Victoria's assistant, Jennifer, led them toward her office. As they approached, Victoria could see the careful way they dressed for this meeting. The older man wore a navy blazer that had seen better years but was impeccably maintained. His wife's dress was simple, elegant in its restraint, but Victoria's trained eye immediately catalogued it as off the rack. The young man's shoes were polished military style, regulation perfect but not expensive leather. "The Henderson family," Jennifer announced, stepping aside to let them enter. Victoria rose from her chair, her smile practiced and professional. "Welcome to Sterling Events. I'm Victoria Sterling." She extended her hand first to Sarah, then to each family member in turn. "Sarah Henderson," the bride said, her handshake firm and warm. "This is my fiancé, Dave Mitchell, and my parents, Bob and Linda Henderson." Bob Henderson's grip was strong despite his injury, and Victoria noticed the slight callus patterns that spoke of years of physical work. Military hands. When Linda Henderson took her hand, Victoria felt the quiet assessment in the woman's gaze, the look of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Please, have a seat." Victoria gestured toward the plush seating area arranged around a glass coffee table. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be wonderful," Linda said, settling beside her husband on the ivory sofa. Victoria noticed how naturally she adjusted her position to accommodate Bob's prosthetic leg, a movement so subtle it spoke of years of practice. As Jennifer went to prepare the refreshments, Victoria settled into her chair across from them, her portfolio balanced on her lap. "So, Sarah, Tell me about your vision for your special day. Sarah's face lit up immediately. We want something elegant but meaningful. Dave and I met at a veterans benefit, and military tradition is so important to both our families. She reached over to squeeze Dave's hand. My father served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and Dave's a 3rd-generation Army officer. We'd love to incorporate some of those traditions into the ceremony. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something subtle shifted in her posture. Military traditions. How interesting. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a gold pen. What specifically did you have in mind? Dave leaned forward slightly. We'd like to have a color guard for the processional, if possible. And Sarah's father would like to wear his dress uniform when he walks her down the aisle. Bob Henderson spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but steady. I was hoping to have my unit colors present, the men I served with. Some didn't make it home. I'd like them to be part of this somehow. Victoria's pen paused over her notepad. She glanced up at Bob, taking in the slight tremor in his left hand that he tried to hide, the careful way he positioned his injured leg. I see. And your budget range? When Sarah named the figure, Victoria felt her professional mask slip for just a moment. It was less than she typically spent on flowers alone for her high-end clients. She recovered quickly, but not before. Linda Henderson caught the reaction. We know it's not a large budget, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of apology that made Victoria's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. But this day means everything to us. We've been saving for 2 years. Of course, Victoria said smoothly, every couple deserves their perfect day. Now regarding the venue. She opened to a section in her portfolio featuring the Ashworth estate, where she'd planned some of her most prestigious events. I was thinking the Rosewood Ballroom might be perfect for your celebration. Very elegant, very refined. She showed them the photographs, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. As for the military elements you mentioned, we'd want to ensure they complement the venue's aesthetic. The Ashworth estate has a certain sophistication that we'd want to maintain. Linda Henderson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What exactly does that mean? Victoria's tone remained pleasant, professional. Well, color guards can be quite dramatic. And dress uniforms, while I'm sure they're meaningful to your family, might not photograph as well as traditional formal wear. A classic black tuxedo has such timeless elegance. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Sarah's face fell slightly, and Dave's expression hardened. Bob Henderson simply looked down at his hands, folded in his lap. The uniform represents my father's service to our country, Sarah said carefully. 22 years of his life. It's not just clothing to us. Of course not, Victoria replied quickly. I completely understand the sentiment. But we want to ensure your photos are something you'll treasure forever, something that looks appropriate for such an elegant venue. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Linda Henderson's back straightened, and Victoria could see the military spouse, steel that had sustained her through deployments and uncertainty and loss. Appropriate, Linda repeated, her voice deceptively calm. Victoria sensed the shift in the room's energy, but pressed on, convinced she knew what was best. What I mean is, we want to create something that reflects the sophistication you deserve. Perhaps we could incorporate military elements in more subtle ways, maybe small flag pins for the boutonnieres instead of a full color guard. Bob Henderson looked up then, and Victoria saw something in his eyes that made her uncomfortable, not anger, that she could have handled. Instead, she saw resignation, the look of a man who'd heard variations of this conversation before. Mr. Henderson, Victoria continued, her voice taking on what she thought was a kindly tone. "I'm sure you want your daughter's wedding to be remembered for all the right reasons. The Ashworth estate caters to a very particular clientele. We want to make sure everything fits." Dave Mitchell spoke for the first time since the introductions, his voice carefully controlled. "Sir, with respect, my fiancé's father earned the right to wear that uniform, the right to be honored for his service." Victoria felt a flicker of irritation. These people didn't understand how things worked in her world, how important image was, how carefully everything had to be curated. "I'm not questioning anyone's service," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm simply thinking about what will work best for the overall vision." Sarah looked between her parents and her fiancé, seeing the tension building. "Maybe we could look at some other options, other venues that might be more accommodating to what we have in mind." Victoria felt control of the situation slipping away. This was supposed to be a straightforward consultation, a chance to elevate their simple vision into something worthy of her reputation. "The Ashworth estate is the finest venue in Maplewood," she said firmly. "Any other choice would be settling for less than you deserve." The implication was clear: take her advice or accept inferior options. It was a tactic that had worked with countless clients before, the subtle pressure of her expertise and connections. But as Victoria looked around the room, she realized this family was different. Linda Henderson was studying her with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd learned to recognize condescension from a mile away. Bob Henderson's expression had closed off entirely, the careful dignity of a man protecting himself from judgment. Dave Mitchell looked like he was reassessing everything about this meeting, his strategic mind already working on alternatives. And Sarah looked heartbroken. "Perhaps," Victoria said, softening her approach slightly, "we could table the military elements for now and focus on the overall event design. Once you see how beautiful everything can be, you might find that some of those traditional touches aren't as necessary as you thought." It was, Victoria believed, a reasonable compromise. She was offering them elegance, sophistication, a chance to have a wedding that would impress everyone who saw it. Why couldn't they see that she was trying to help them rise above their circumstances? The Henderson family exchanged glances, a lifetime of military moves and difficult decisions passing between them in silent communication. Finally, Sarah spoke. "We appreciate your time, Miss Sterling. Could we have a day or two to think about everything?" Victoria felt victory within her grasp. They needed time to realize she was right, to understand that her vision was superior to their simple military traditions. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I think once you've had a chance to consider everything, you'll see that what I'm proposing will give you a wedding that's truly special." As the Henderson family prepared to leave, Victoria already began planning how she would transform their modest military-themed vision into something worthy of the Sterling event's name. She would show them what real elegance looked like, what a proper society wedding should be. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Victoria alone in her perfect office with its perfect views and perfect accessories. She returned to her desk, already making notes about color schemes and menu options, confident that she would soon have another successful transformation to add to her portfolio. Outside, in the parking lot, the Henderson family stood beside their practical sedan, the weight of the consultation settling around them like a heavy coat. But Victoria didn't see that. She was already planning how to elevate their simple dreams into something that would photograph beautifully and enhance her reputation. After all, that's what perfection required. The drive home from Victoria Sterling's office passed in weighted silence. Sarah stared through the passenger window as Dave, navigated Maplewood's tree-lined streets, her mind replaying every subtle slight, every dismissive glance. In the back seat, her parents maintained the careful stillness of people who'd weathered disappointment without showing it. "We could find other planners," Dave finally said. "With our budget?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "She was probably the only one willing to meet with us." Linda Henderson's voice carried from the back seat, steady and measured. "There are other ways to have a beautiful wedding, honey." But Sarah wasn't ready for comfort. The morning had stripped away dreams she'd nurtured for months, visions of walking down an elegant aisle in a dress that photographed like magazine perfection, surrounded by sophistication that would make their love story feel as important as it was to them. Victoria Sterling represented everything Sarah had imagined, and now that vision felt tainted. As they pulled into their modest ranch house driveway, the longest Sarah had lived anywhere thanks to her father's medical retirement, she glimpsed her mother's small garden, practical vegetables mixed with cheerful flowers, everything chosen for resilience rather than appearance. Beautiful in its own way, but not the elegance she'd dreamed of. Inside, Bob Henderson settled heavily into his recliner, morning stress evident in how carefully he positioned his prosthetic leg. 22 years of military bearing couldn't entirely mask the chronic pain that had become his constant companion since Kandahar, when an IED changed everything. Sarah watched her father close his eyes, and suddenly she was 8 again, standing in their Germany base housing doorway as her mother explained why Daddy would come home different. The little girl who'd counted calendar days until his return, imagining him walking through the door in crisp uniform, had instead met a man struggling to hide pain behind his gentle smile. "Dad," she said softly, kneeling beside his chair, "I'm sorry about what she said, about the uniform." Bob's eyes opened, and he touched her hair the way he had when she was small. "Sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for." But Sarah felt responsible. She'd chosen Victoria Sterling because she'd wanted something special, something announcing to the world that their love deserved the same celebration as any wealthy couple's. Instead, she'd subjected her family to an hour of barely concealed disdain. From the kitchen came familiar sounds of her mother making coffee, the ritual that had sustained Linda Henderson through 3 deployments, countless moves, and Bob's long recovery months. Sarah had inherited her mother's diplomatic nature, but she'd also learned something else from military life, when to fight and when to wait for better ground. "Tell me about your first wedding," Sarah called to her mother, settling on the floor. Beside her father's chair, Linda appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, expressions softening at the familiar request. Sarah had heard this story countless times, but today she needed the reminder of what truly mattered. "Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio," Linda began, settling onto the couch. "Your father had 3-day leave before shipping to his first deployment. I wore a blue dress from J.C. Penney, and he wore his dress uniform because it was the only suit he owned. The photographer was your father's friend from basic training," Bob added, voice warming with memory. "Kid had never held a professional camera, but he took 2 rolls of film and wouldn't let us pay him." Sarah smiled despite her mood. She'd seen those pictures countless times, her parents young and glowing, her father's uniform crisp and proud, her mother's face radiant. They looked like movie stars in their happiness, like the most elegant couple in the world. "Mrs. Henderson down the hall let me borrow her grandmother's pearls," Linda continued, "and your father's unit surprised us with a sword arch when we came out of the courthouse. I felt like a princess." The sword arch. Sarah had grown up hearing about that moment, how Bob's fellow soldiers appeared without warning, their dress sabers forming a gleaming canopy over the newlyweds. In every telling, her mother's voice held the same wonder, as if 24 years later she could still feel that magic. "That's what I wanted," Sarah whispered, "not the courthouse part, but that feeling, like our love deserved ceremony, like Dad's service meant something. Bob's hand found hers, gripped strong despite the tremor Victoria Sterling had tried not to notice. "It does mean something, sweetheart, to the people who matter." Across town, Victoria Sterling stood in her Maplewood condo's marble-tiled foyer, studying the oil painting dominating the entrance wall. She'd commissioned it 5 years ago from an artist specializing in old money aesthetic, a landscape suggesting generations of quiet wealth, the understated elegance she'd learned to recognize in affluent clients. The painting was beautiful and utterly fake, like almost everything else in her carefully curated life. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text, confirming the afternoon Pemberton family appointment. Old Connecticut money planning their daughter's engagement party. The kind of client who would never question Victoria's vision, who understood instinctively that her expertise was worth the premium price. But climbing the stairs to her bedroom, Victoria found herself thinking about Bob Henderson's hands. Working, ends marked by service and sacrifice. They reminded her of someone, though she'd spent years trying to forget. In her walk-in closet, behind rows of designer suits and shoes costing more than most people's rent, Victoria kept a single cardboard box. She hadn't opened it in 3 years, but today something about the Henderson family's quiet dignity had loosened the locks she'd built around her past. Inside were photographs from another life, a younger Victoria, Vicky then, standing beside her father outside their small Johnstown, Pennsylvania house. His hands were permanently coal-stained, his back bent from years underground, but his smile was proud as he posed beside his daughter in her high school graduation gown. "First one in the family to go to college," he'd said that day, voice rough. From years breathing coal dust, going to make something of herself. Victoria, Vicky, had hugged him tight, not caring about dirt on his work clothes or how her classmates' parents looked at him. She'd been proud of those hands, proud of the man who'd worked double shifts to pay for her dreams. When had that changed? When had she learned to be ashamed of the calluses that built her future? The transformation had been gradual, she told herself, professional necessity. Her first wealthy client, Mrs. Ashworth's daughter's wedding, had required understanding a world where presentation mattered more than substance. Victoria had watched, learned, adapted. She'd traded her father's practical values for something that looked more valuable. By the time her marriage to Michael fell apart, Victoria was already becoming someone else. Someone who couldn't tolerate his grease-stained uniforms from the auto shop, who flinched when he spoke too loudly at country club events she'd convinced him to attend. "You're not the girl I married," he'd said the night she asked for divorce. That girl wouldn't have been ashamed of where she came from. He'd been right, but Victoria had convinced herself that growth meant leaving the past behind, that success required shedding everything connecting her to coal dust and small-town limitations. Now, holding a photograph of her father's proud smile, Victoria felt something crack in the foundation she'd built her new life upon. Bob Henderson had the same pride, the same dignity in honest work and service, the same hands that had built something meaningful, even if it didn't photograph well for magazine spreads. Victoria closed the box and returned it to its hiding place. She had the Pemberton appointment to prepare for, and they would expect the sophisticated wedding planner they were paying premium rates to secure. They wouldn't want to hear about coal miners' daughters or the complicated mathematics of transformation. But as she selected her afternoon outfit, something signaling success and refinement, Victoria couldn't shake the image of Linda Henderson's assessing gaze. The military spouse had recognized something in Victoria's performance, had seen through the carefully constructed facade to whatever remained of the girl from Pennsylvania, the girl who had once understood the difference between true worth and expensive packaging. Back in the Henderson kitchen, Sarah was helping her mother prepare lunch when Dave returned from errands. He moved with economical grace of someone accustomed to making decisions quickly, but Sarah could see tension in his shoulders. "I made some calls," he said, setting grocery bags on the counter, "about other wedding options." Sarah's heart sank. After this morning's humiliation, the thought of starting over with another planner, explaining their budget, defending their traditions, felt overwhelming. "What did you find?" Dave's expression was carefully neutral, the face he wore when working through complex problems. "A few possibilities. But Sarah, what if we didn't need to compromise?" Before she could ask what he meant, Dave's phone rang. The caller ID showed Colin Morrison, and Sarah watched her fiancé's posture straighten automatically. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, stepping into the living room. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she noticed how her father's attention sharpened at Colonel Morrison's name. Pat Morrison had served with Bob in Afghanistan, had visited him in the military hospital after the IED attack. She was the kind of officer who never forgot her people. When Dave returned to the kitchen, something had changed in his expression, a quiet determination that reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with him. "What was that about?" she asked. Dave glanced toward the living room, where her parents were pretending not to listen, just checking on some wedding details. But Sarah knew that look. It was the expression Dave wore when planning something, when his strategic mind was working through variables and possibilities. She'd seen it before, and it usually meant he was about to surprise her. "Dave, trust me," he said, taking her hands in his. "Your father is going to wear his dress uniform, and he's going to be honored the way he deserves. I promise." The conviction in his voice made something warm bloom in Sarah's chest. This was why she was marrying him, not just because she loved him, but because he understood what mattered, because he saw her family the way she did, with respect and admiration rather than condescension. As Dave helped her mother finish preparing lunch, Sarah found herself thinking about Victoria Sterling's perfect office, with its perfect accessories and perfect disdain. The wedding planner had everything Sarah thought she wanted: elegance, sophistication, the ability to create magazine-worthy celebrations. But watching Dave quietly help her father to the dining room, seeing how he automatically adjusted his pace to accommodate Bob's gait, Sarah realized that true elegance had nothing to do with crystal chandeliers or designer flowers. It had everything to do with honor. And if Victoria Sterling couldn't see that, perhaps she wasn't the right person to celebrate their love after all. 3 days later, Victoria Sterling spread the revised wedding portfolio across her conference table, like a general deploying battle plans. She'd spent the weekend transforming the Henderson family's modest military-themed vision into something worthy of the Sterling event's reputation, and the results were impressive. Gone were the requests for color guards and sword arches, replaced with elegant alternatives that would photograph beautifully and reflect the sophistication her brand demanded. Sarah Henderson sat across from her, Dave at her side, while her parents occupied the chairs Victoria had strategically positioned slightly back from the table, a subtle psychological positioning that established hierarchy without appearing obvious. Victoria had learned such techniques from her wealthiest clients, the ones who understood that power was often about where people sat and who spoke first. "I think you're going to love what I've put together," Victoria began, her voice carrying the confident warmth of someone about to reveal a masterpiece. "I've taken your core vision and elevated it into something truly spectacular." She opened to the first presentation board, revealing the Ashworth Estate's grand ballroom decorated in navy and gold, colors she'd chosen to nod toward military tradition while maintaining sophistication. "As you can see, I've incorporated the patriotic elements you mentioned, but in a way that complements the venue's natural elegance." Sarah leaned forward, studying the images. The navy was deeper than the traditional military blue, The gold, more muted. Beautiful, certainly, but somehow sanitized. "It's lovely," she said carefully. "But what about the color guard we discussed?" Victoria's smile never wavered. "I've found something even better." She turned to the next board, revealing her alternative. A string quartet positioned where the color guard would have stood. Their instruments decorated with small navy ribbons. Live classical music creates such a refined atmosphere, much more timeless than military formations. Dave's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The color guard wasn't about atmosphere, it was about honoring service. "Of course," Victoria replied smoothly, "and we're doing that in a much more sophisticated way." She gestured to the next image, the altar area decorated with elegant navy draping and gold accents, but no American flags, no military symbols. "See how clean and elegant this looks? Your photos will be absolutely stunning." Bob Henderson had been silent since they'd arrived, but now he shifted in his chair, the movement drawing Victoria's attention. She'd noticed he was wearing khakis and a polo shirt today instead of the blazer from their first meeting, and she took it as confirmation that he understood the need to dress appropriately for different occasions. "Miss Sterling," Bob said quietly, "about the dress uniform." "Oh yes," Victoria interrupted, turning to another section of her portfolio with visible enthusiasm. "I have the perfect solution for that." She revealed a photograph of a groom in an elegant black tuxedo, the image clearly borrowed from a luxury wedding magazine. "Custom tailoring makes such a difference. I know an excellent menswear specialist who can create something that will complement Sarah's dress beautifully." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Sarah looked between her father and her fiancé, seeing the careful control both men were exercising. Linda Henderson's expression had gone completely neutral, the diplomatic face she'd perfected during years of military functions where protocol mattered more than personal feelings. "A tuxedo is very nice," Sarah said diplomatically, "but Dad's dress uniform means something special to our family." Victoria felt a flicker of irritation. She'd spent her weekend creating a solution that would solve all their problems, elevating their simple vision into something magazine-worthy, and they were still fixated on military costumes that would look out of place in an elegant venue. "I understand the sentimental value," Victoria said, her tone taking on the patient quality she used with difficult clients. "But we need to think about the overall aesthetic. The Ashworth estate has hosted some of the most prestigious events on the East Coast. Their standards are quite high." Linda Henderson spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. "What exactly do you mean by standards?" Something in her tone made Victoria pause, but she pressed on, convinced that clear explanation would help them understand. "The venue caters to a very particular clientele. Families with generational wealth, society connections. They expect a certain level of refinement. And a military dress uniform doesn't meet that standard." Dave's voice was carefully controlled, but Victoria could hear the edge beneath it. "It's not about meeting standards," Victoria backtracked quickly. "It's about creating cohesion. Look." She pulled out another image, this one showing a wedding party in perfectly coordinated formal wear. "See how elegant and unified this looks? Every element works together to create one beautiful picture." Bob Henderson looked down at his hands, and Victoria felt a moment of sympathy. The poor man probably felt overwhelmed by all this elegance, uncertain about fitting into a world so far above his usual experiences. She softened her approach. "Mr. Henderson, I know this is your daughter's special day, and you want to look your best for her. A custom tuxedo will be much more flattering than a military uniform, more appropriate for the setting." The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the room. Linda Henderson's back straightened, and Dave's hands clenched slightly on the table. "Appropriate," Linda repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Victoria sensed she'd misspoken, but couldn't understand why. She was trying to help them avoid embarrassment, to ensure they fit seamlessly into the sophisticated environment of the Ashworth estate. What I mean is, we want you to feel comfortable and confident. A tuxedo is classic, timeless. Miss Sterling, Bob interrupted, his voice still gentle, but carrying an authority that made Victoria pause. I wore this uniform for 22 years. I wore it in 3 combat deployments. I wore it when I received the Purple Heart after an IED took my leg. It's not a costume. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course it's not. I didn't mean to suggest. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then what did you mean? Dave asked, leaning forward. Slightly, because it sounds like you're saying my future father-in-law's military service isn't good enough for your venue. That's not what I said. Victoria's professional composure began to crack. These people were determined to misunderstand her efforts to help them. I'm trying to create something beautiful for you, something you'll be proud to look back on. We're already proud, Sarah said quietly, but with unmistakable firmness. We're proud of Dad's service. We're proud of our family's tradition. That's what we want to celebrate. Victoria felt control of the consultation slipping away. This was supposed to be the moment when clients saw her vision and understood how much better it was than their original ideas. Instead, they seemed determined to cling to elements that would compromise the elegant aesthetic she'd worked so hard to create. Sarah, Victoria said, trying a different approach, I understand family is important, but this is your wedding day. Don't you want it to be special? Don't you want photos you'll treasure forever, instead of something that looks like a military ceremony? The disdain in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah's face went pale, and Dave's expression hardened completely. Miss Sterling, Linda Henderson said, rising from her chair with the measured grace of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. I think we need to take a step back here. Victoria remained seated, looking up at the older woman with confusion. I'm simply trying to ensure your daughter has the wedding she deserves. The Ashworth estate, Linda interrupted, will be lucky to host a celebration of love between 2 people who understand honor and commitment. If they can't appreciate that, perhaps it's not the right venue for us. Victoria felt a spike of panic. She couldn't lose this wedding entirely. Her reputation depended on successful transformations, on taking ordinary people and helping them achieve extraordinary celebrations. Mrs. Henderson, please. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Of course your family's service is admirable. I'm simply suggesting we present it in a way that fits the venue's aesthetic. Whose aesthetic? Dave asked, standing to join his future mother-in-law. Yours? The venue's? Or the aesthetic of people who think military service is something to be hidden? Victoria felt cornered, defensive. I never said anything about hiding it. I'm talking about presentation, about creating something elegant. Elegant, Bob Henderson repeated, struggling to his feet with careful dignity. Ms. Sterling, I've been to state dinners at the Pentagon. I've attended ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery. I've seen real elegance, and it has nothing to do with hiding who you are or what you've done in service to your country. The rebuke was delivered quietly, without anger, but it hit Victoria like a physical blow. She found herself looking at Bob Henderson, really looking at him, and seeing not the burden she'd assumed he would be, but a man whose quiet dignity put her expensive sophistication to shame. I think we should go, Sarah said, gathering her purse with shaking hands. This isn't working. Panic flooded Victoria's system. Wait, please. I think we can find a compromise. A compromise, Dave said, his voice flat. Like asking a decorated veteran to hide his service so he doesn't embarrass your other clients? Victoria scrambled for the right words, the professional recovery that had salvaged difficult situations before. That's not what I meant. Look, we can incorporate some military elements, small ones, maybe flag pins for the boutonnières, or a single honor guard member. One soldier, Linda said, her voice incredulous, to represent an entire military family's service. It's a starting point, Victoria insisted. We can build from there, find ways to honor your traditions that work within the venue's requirements. No. The word came from Sarah, spoken with quiet finality. Mum's right. This isn't working. Victoria watched her weekend's work collapse as the Henderson family prepared to leave. Everything she'd created, every elegant solution she'd developed, dismissed because they couldn't see past their stubborn attachment to military theatrics. "Sarah, please," Victoria tried once more. "Your dress, the flowers, the photography, we can create something magical, something that will make you feel like a princess." Sarah paused at the door, looking back with an expression that was somehow both sad and determined. "Miss Sterling, I don't want to feel like a princess. I want to feel proud of my family, proud of the man who raised me, proud of the values that made me who I am. If you can't help us celebrate that, then we need to find someone who can." The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Victoria alone with her scattered presentation boards and the echo of quiet dignity that had somehow made her feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her designer office. Outside in the parking lot, the Henderson family stood in a tight circle, the weight of the morning settling around them, but this time the silence wasn't heavy with disappointment. It carried something else, a shared recognition that they'd just taken a stand for something more important than elegant photographs or sophisticated venues. They'd stood up for honor, and walking away from Victoria Sterling's perfect vision somehow felt like the most elegant thing they could have done. Dave Mitchell's fingers traced the worn edges of his military contact list as he sat in his apartment's small kitchen, the morning light casting long shadows across the table. Sarah was at her teaching job, and her parents were meeting with Victoria. Again, another session that would likely leave them feeling smaller and less welcome in their own daughter's wedding. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Colonel Morrison speaking. Ma'am, it's Captain Mitchell. I need to ask a favor." Dave's voice carried the formal respect ingrained through years of service, but beneath it lay something more personal, desperation mixed with determination. Patricia Morrison had served alongside Bob Henderson in Afghanistan. She'd been there the day the IED took his leg, had helped carry him to the medevac helicopter. More importantly, she understood what it meant when civilians looked at a wounded warrior and saw burden instead of sacrifice. "What can I do for you, Captain?" Dave explained the situation. Victoria's systematic erasure of military traditions, her condescending treatment of Bob, the way she'd made it clear that their service meant nothing in her pristine world. As he spoke, he could hear the colonel's breathing grow more controlled, the way it always did when she was containing anger. "That woman has no idea who she's dealing with," Morrison said finally. "Bob Henderson is one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with. If she thinks she can diminish his honor at his daughter's wedding—" "I need an honor guard, Mom. Full dress blues. Something that shows Sarah's family the respect they deserve." "Consider it done. How many do you need?" Meanwhile, across town, Victoria was making her final adjustments to what she privately called the Henderson problem. She'd successfully relegated Bob's seating to the third row, close enough that Sarah wouldn't complain, far enough that his wheelchair wouldn't be prominently visible in the photos. The American flag boutonniere he'd requested had been replaced with a simple white rose. Every military element had been sanitized into generic elegance. "Mrs. Sterling?" Her new assistant, Melissa, had quit the day before with a resignation. letter that mentioned fundamental differences in values stood nervously in the doorway. The Henderson family called. They wanted to confirm the final details. Victoria didn't look up from her seating chart. Tell them everything is under control, exactly as it should be. What Victoria didn't know was that at that very moment, phone calls were being made across 3 states. Veterans who had served with Bob Henderson, current active duty personnel who respected his sacrifice, retired officers who understood the importance of honoring their own. The military community was a tight-knit family, and when one of their own was being disrespected, they responded with the same loyalty they'd shown on the battlefield. Dave closed his phone and looked at the simple gold band on his finger. His grandfather's wedding ring, worn through 2 wars and 50 years of marriage. Some things he thought were worth fighting for, and sometimes the best battles were won not with confrontation, but with honor displayed so clearly that denial became impossible. The wedding was 3 days away. The day before the wedding dawned, grey and overcast, matching the heaviness that had settled over the Henderson household. Sarah sat at her childhood kitchen table, staring at the final timeline Victoria had delivered that morning. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every moment accounted for, except for the parts that mattered most to her family. She wants Dad in the back during photos, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Says it's for better composition. While Linda Henderson set down her coffee cup with deliberate control, the kind of restraint that came from 25 years of military spouse training. Your father's been through worse than being sidelined by a wedding planner, sweetheart. But Sarah could see the pain in her mother's eyes, the same pain she'd glimpsed in her father's face when Victoria had handed him a generic boutonniere to replace the small American flag pin he'd planned to wear. Bob Henderson had accepted the substitution without complaint, just as he'd accepted every other indignity Victoria had imposed. But Sarah had watched something dim in his expression with each concession. Across town, Victoria was conducting her final walkthrough of the venue, her heels clicking against the marble floors of the Ashworth Estate's grand ballroom. Everything was perfect. The crystal chandeliers cast the right amount of warm light. The white roses and orchids created elegant focal points, and not a single element reminded anyone that this was a military family celebration. The flag display needs to go, she told her assistant, pointing to a small arrangement Linda Henderson had quietly placed near the guest book. It clashes with the color scheme. What Victoria didn't notice was Chuck Ashworth himself standing in the doorway, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he observed her systematic removal of anything that honored service or sacrifice. His own Purple Heart lay locked in a desk drawer upstairs, earned in Vietnam when he was barely older than the young captain marrying Sarah Henderson. That evening, Bob Henderson sat alone on his back porch, his prosthetic leg removed and propped against the railing. The phantom pain was worse tonight, but he'd learned to live with discomfort. What was harder to bear was the growing certainty that his presence at Sarah's wedding would be more burden than blessing. His phone buzzed with a text from his son deployed overseas. "Wish I could be there tomorrow, Dad. Make sure you wear the dress blues. Show them what honor looks like." Bob stared at the message for a long time, thinking about the uniform hanging in his closet, the same uniform Victoria had deemed inappropriate for the venue's aesthetic. Tomorrow, he would wear a rented tuxedo and sit in the back row, invisible in his own daughter's moment of joy. 20 miles away, Dave Mitchell was receiving final confirmations from Colonel Morrison. The honor guard was assembled, their dress uniforms pressed and ready. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or disaster, but either way, it would bring truth. The storm was coming, and not even Victoria Sterling could control the weather. Honor Guard, Part 6, The Arrival of Honor. The morning of Sarah's wedding. broke clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the stained-glass windows of St. Michael's Chapel. Victoria arrived 2 hours early, clipboard in hand, orchestrating her vision of perfection with military precision, an irony that would have amused her if she'd been capable of recognizing it. Sarah stood before the chapel's antique mirror in her simple but elegant dress, while Linda fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to Dave's grandmother. The bride's smile was brave but fragile, like someone trying to convince herself that compromise hadn't become surrender. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Linda whispered, but her eyes held the sadness of a mother watching her daughter sacrifice pieces of herself for the sake of peace. In the groom's quarters, Bob Henderson struggled with his rented tuxedo, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar cufflinks. His dress uniform hung forgotten in the closet at home, deemed unworthy of Victoria's aesthetic vision. Dave watched, his future father-in-law's quiet dignity, feeling the weight of his secret plan like a stone in his chest. The ceremony began precisely on schedule. Victoria positioned herself at the back of the chapel, her satisfied smile reflecting the perfection of her sanitized vision. Bob walked Sarah down the aisle in his civilian clothes, his slight limp the only reminder of his service and sacrifice. Everything was exactly as Victoria had planned, which is why the rumble of vehicles outside the chapel caught everyone by surprise. The first sign was the synchronous slam of car doors, followed by the measured cadence of polished boots on gravel. Victoria's head snapped toward the sound, her face shifting from satisfaction to confusion to something approaching alarm. The chapel doors opened with ceremonial precision. Colonel Patricia Morrison entered first, her dress blues immaculate, silver eagles gleaming on her shoulders. Behind her marched 8 members of the Honor Guard, their movements synchronized. Through years of training, their bearing speaking of battles fought and brothers lost. The American flag they carried snapped smartly in the afternoon breeze, flowing through the open doors. The congregation rose instinctively, a ripple of recognition and respect flowing through the assembled guests. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes as she recognized the magnitude of Dave's surprise. Bob Henderson straightened in his wheelchair, his entire bearing transforming as he understood what was happening. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her carefully orchestrated event suddenly beyond her control. Colonel Morrison's voice rang clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to honor Sergeant Major Robert Henderson, a soldier who gave his blood for his country and now gives his daughter in marriage to one of our finest officers." The Honor Guard moved with practiced precision, forming a corridor of respect as they presented arms. In that moment, Victoria's sanitized vision crumbled, replaced by something far more powerful: authentic honor, genuine respect, and the unbreakable bonds of military brotherhood. The wedding she had tried to control had become something she could never understand, a celebration of service, sacrifice, and love that transcended her shallow definitions of worth. The reception at the Ashworth estate hummed with an energy Victoria had never experienced in all her years of planning events. The Honor Guard's unexpected arrival had transformed the atmosphere from polite celebration to genuine joy, and Victoria found herself watching from the sidelines as her carefully orchestrated vision took on a life of its own. Military personnel mingled effortlessly with civilian guests, sharing stories and laughter that transcended the social boundaries Victoria had spent years learning to navigate. Bob Henderson, still in his civilian tuxedo but now wearing the Purple Heart that Colonel Morrison had pinned to his lapel during the ceremony, sat surrounded by veterans who understood the weight of his sacrifice without needing explanation. Victoria retreated to her makeshift command center in the estate's library, ostensibly to coordinate the evening's timeline, but really to escape the sight of her irrelevance. She was adjusting the placement cards for the 10th time when she heard familiar voices in the hallway, her catering coordinator, speaking with someone whose voice made her heart skip. "Emma? Emma Sterling, what are you doing here?" Victoria's blood turned to ice. Her daughter's voice, bright with excitement, carried clearly through the open door. "I'm helping with the catering. Dad got me the job. I wanted to surprise Mom, but also—" Emma's voice dropped conspiratorially. "I've been volunteering at the VA hospital back home. When Dad told me about this wedding, about the military family, I knew I had to be here." Victoria pressed herself against the wall, her designer heels suddenly unsteady beneath her. Emma was supposed to be in Pennsylvania with Michael, not here, not witnessing. "The honor guard ceremony was incredible," Emma continued. "I can't believe someone tried to keep that family from having military traditions at their own daughter's wedding. Who does that?" The catering coordinator's response was lost as Victoria's world tilted. Her 16-year-old daughter, idealistic, passionate Emma, who volunteered at veterans' hospitals, was here, had witnessed everything, and clearly didn't know her mother was the villain in this story. Victoria forced herself to breathe, to think. She could salvage this. Emma didn't have to know the extent of her role. She could present herself as simply the planner who accommodated a last-minute change. But as she stepped into the hallway, she came face to face with Michael. Her ex-husband stood there in the crisp white shirt and black slacks of the catering staff, his calloused hands holding a tray of champagne glasses. The man she'd divorced because his mechanic's wage and blue-collar background no longer fit her. Carefully crafted image of success. The man who'd raised their daughter with the values Victoria had abandoned in her climb towards social acceptability. "Hello, Victoria." His voice was quiet, controlled, but she could see the knowledge in his eyes. He knew exactly what she'd done. "Michael, I didn't know you were... How did you..." "Dave Mitchell called the catering company where I work. Weekends, asked specifically for people who understood military families." Michael's gaze was steady, disappointed rather than angry. "Emma wanted to come. She's been talking about this wedding for weeks, about how proud she was that her mother was planning such an important celebration for a military family." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. "She doesn't understand the complexities of..." "She understands honor," Michael interrupted gently. "Something I apparently failed to teach you, but somehow she learned anyway." Through the ballroom's French doors, Victoria could see Emma now, kneeling beside Bob Henderson's wheelchair, listening intently as he showed her photographs from his deployment. Her daughter's face was radiant with genuine interest and respect, the same expression Victoria remembered from Emma's childhood, before Victoria had become too busy climbing social ladders to notice her daughter's inherent goodness. "She volunteers 30 hours a week at the VA," Michael continued, "reads to the wounded veterans, helps with physical therapy sessions. She was so excited when I told her about this job because she thought she'd finally get to see her mother, doing something that mattered." Victoria's carefully applied makeup felt heavy on her face as she watched her daughter, her beautiful, principled daughter, embody everything Victoria had convinced herself was naive and unprofitable. Emma's easy conversation with the military guests, her obvious comfort with people Victoria had dismissed as beneath her notice, revealed a character that shamed Victoria's recent choices. "I need to fix this," Victoria whispered, more to herself than to Michael. "Do you?" Michael's question was gentle but pointed. "Or do you need to figure out who you really want to be?" Before Victoria could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up with joy. "Mom, I've been looking everywhere for you." Emma rushed forward, embracing Victoria with the unguarded affection of a daughter who still believed in her mother's goodness. "This wedding is incredible. The Henderson family is amazing. Mr. Henderson was just telling me about his service in Afghanistan, and Mrs. Henderson has been showing me pictures of all the military bases where Sarah grew up. You must be so proud to be part of celebrating their love story." Victoria felt her throat close as she looked into Emma's trusting eyes. Her daughter believed she was witnessing her mother's finest work, not her greatest shame. The honor guard ceremony was so beautiful. Emma continued, her voice thick with emotion. I started crying when they presented Mr. Henderson with that flag. Dad said you helped coordinate it all. Victoria's eyes met Michael's over their daughter's head. He raised an eyebrow slightly, a question. Would she tell the truth, or would she let Emma continue believing in a version of her mother that no longer existed? The choice felt like standing at a crossroads with her daughter's faith in one direction and her own carefully constructed life in the other. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, her daughter's trusting gaze and Michael's knowing look creating a pressure that threatened to shatter the carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for years. Emma's innocent assumption that her mother had helped orchestrate the honor guard ceremony felt like a knife turning in Victoria's chest. I need to check on the dinner service, Victoria managed, her voice strained. Emma, sweetheart, why don't you help your father? I'll catch up with you later. But as she turned to flee, Emma caught her arm with gentle persistence. Mom, wait, I wanted to tell you something important. Emma's eyes sparkled with the kind of earnest emotion that had always made Victoria simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. Working with the veterans at the hospital has taught me so much about real service, about what it means to sacrifice for others. Seeing you honor that tonight, it makes me so proud to be your daughter. The words landed like physical blows. Victoria felt her throat constrict as she realized how completely she'd failed the person who mattered most to her. Her daughter's admiration was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who Victoria had become, or perhaps, more accurately, who she'd chosen to be. Michael stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. Tell her the truth, Vic. She's strong enough to handle it, and she deserves better than living a lie. But before Victoria could respond, Chuck Ashworth's voice boomed from the ballroom's makeshift stage, calling for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment, I believe our wedding planner would like to say a few words about tonight's celebration. Victoria's stomach dropped. She hadn't planned to speak, had specifically avoided it because she knew her usual polished remarks about elegant celebrations would ring hollow after the honor guard's appearance. But Charles Ashworth was not a man who took no for an answer, and every eye in the ballroom was now turning toward her expectantly. Emma beamed at her mother, clearly anticipating a speech that would match the dignity of the evening's unexpected transformation. Michael's expression was more complex, equal parts sympathy and challenge, as if he understood exactly how trapped Victoria felt. With no escape available, Victoria walked toward the microphone, her heels clicking against the gay marble floor with the rhythm of a death march. The assembled guests, military personnel and civilians alike, watched her with polite attention. Bob Henderson sat in the front row, his purple heart catching the light from the chandeliers, Linda beside him with her arm linked through his. Sarah and Dave stood near the cake table, their faces glowing with the happiness that Victoria had tried so hard to sanitize and control. Victoria cleared her throat, acutely aware that whatever she said next would either compound her shame or begin the long process of redemption. She had prepared no remarks because she'd never intended to acknowledge the very elements that had made tonight meaningful. When the Henderson family first came to my office, she began, her voice carrying the professional smoothness that had built her reputation, they had a very specific vision for their daughter's wedding. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Victoria felt Emma's encouraging smile from across the room and realized she was at a crossroads that would define not just her relationship with her daughter, but who she would choose to be going forward. They wanted to honor their military heritage, Victoria continued, her voice growing steadier. They wanted traditions that reflected service and sacrifice. They wanted... She paused, the prepared words about elevating their vision dying in her throat as she met Bob Henderson's eyes. They wanted exactly what you witnessed tonight. The crowd's attention sharpened, sensing something significant in her tone. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the microphone. What you saw tonight, the honor guard, the flag, ceremony, the recognition of Sergeant Major Henderson's service, that was not my doing. That beautiful, meaningful tribute was arranged by Captain Mitchell because he understood something I had forgotten. A hush fell over the ballroom. Even the catering staff stopped their quiet movements to listen. I spent weeks trying to convince this family that their traditions weren't sophisticated enough for this venue. I replaced their meaningful symbols with generic elegance. I relegated a wounded warrior to the back row of his own daughter's wedding because I thought a wheelchair didn't fit my aesthetic vision. Emma's face had gone pale, her expression shifting from pride to confusion, to something approaching horror as she realized what her mother was confessing. Michael stepped closer to their daughter, ready to offer support, while keeping his eyes fixed on Victoria with an expression that mixed disappointment with the faintest glimmer of hope. The truth is, Victoria's voice cracked slightly, I forgot what real honor looks like. I mistook price tags for value, exclusivity for excellence. This family tried to teach me about dignity and tradition, and I responded with prejudice and condescension. Bob Henderson wheeled his chair slightly forward, his weathered face showing not anger, but something far more devastating: pity. Linda reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of a couple who had weathered storms together. Captain Mitchell gave this family what I refused to provide: respect. The honor guard gave Sergeant Major Henderson what I tried to deny him: recognition. And this community showed me what I had lost in my pursuit of social status: the ability to recognize true worth when it was sitting right in front of me. The silence in the ballroom was complete now, heavy with the weight of Victoria's public confession. She could see her daughter's face crumpling as the full magnitude of her mother's betrayal became clear, could feel the judgment of every person in the room as they processed her admission of prejudice and cruelty. But for the first time in years, Victoria felt something she'd forgotten existed: the possibility of redemption through truth. The silence that followed Victoria's confession stretched like a held breath. She stood at the microphone, her hands trembling against the metal stand, watching as her words settled over the assembled guests like stones dropped into still water. The ripples of shock, disappointment, and judgment spread outward from face to face until the entire ballroom seemed frozen in collective disbelief. Emma's face had gone from pale to ashen, her eyes wide with the kind of devastation that comes from watching a fundamental truth about the world crumble. Michael moved closer to their daughter, his protective instincts overriding whatever complex emotions Victoria's confession had stirred in him. The betrayal in Emma's expression was so complete, so raw, that Victoria felt something break inside her chest. "Emma?" Victoria started, stepping away from the microphone, but her daughter turned and fled toward the exit, pushing past the catering staff and guests with the desperate urgency of someone who couldn't bear to hear another word. Michael's eyes met Victoria's across the silent ballroom. "I'll go after her," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in his voice, just the weary sadness of a man who'd watched this tragedy unfold over years rather than minutes. The spell of silence broke as conversations resumed in hushed tones. Throughout the ballroom, Victoria became acutely aware of the eyes upon her, some sympathetic, others coldly judgmental, most simply confused by the turn the evening had taken. Chuck Ashworth approached the microphone, his weathered face unreadable. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling, for your honesty," he said, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of a man accustomed to navigating delicate social situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's continue celebrating the marriage of Sarah and Dave Mitchell." Victoria fled. She found herself in Chuck Ashworth's private study, a masculine room lined with leather-bound books and military memorabilia that suddenly took on new significance in light of everything she'd learned tonight. Her hands shook. As she collapsed into one of the wingback chairs, the weight of her public confession crushing down upon her like a physical force. For 20 minutes, she sat in silence, staring at a photograph on Ashworth's desk, a young man in Vietnam era. Fatigues, his face serious beneath a military cap. The resemblance to Chuck was unmistakable, and Victoria realized she was looking at a picture of her host as a young soldier. Here was another truth she'd missed, another assumption that had proven wrong. A soft knock interrupted her spiral of self-recrimination. "Come in," she called, expecting Michael or perhaps one of the catering staff. Instead, Bob Henderson wheeled his chair through the doorway. Victoria's breath caught. Victoria felt fresh tears threatening. "Emma hates me." "Emma loves you," Linda corrected. "That's why she's so devastated. You don't hurt that deeply unless you care that much. But she's 16, and 16-year-olds think in absolutes. She'll need time to process, to understand that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us forever." Bob leaned forward in his wheelchair. "When I was recovering from my injury, learning to use this chair, I went through a period where I hated everyone who tried to help me. Physical therapists, other veterans, even Linda. I was so angry at what I'd lost that I couldn't see what I still had." "It took months," Linda added, "for him to realize that accepting help wasn't admitting weakness. It was acknowledging that we're all interconnected, that none of us make it alone." Victoria looked between them. These two people she'd dismissed and diminished, who were now offering her wisdom and something that might eventually become forgiveness. "Why are you being kind to me after everything I put you through?" "Because," Bob said simply, "that's what service means. Not just military service, human service. We help each other carry the weight, even when the person stumbling is someone who made our load heavier." Through the study's window, Victoria could see the reception continuing on the estate's terrace. Sarah and Dave were dancing their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by military personnel and civilians who had somehow found common ground in celebration. The honor guard members stood at attention around the dance floor, their presence transforming what could have been a generic society wedding into something transcendent. "I need to make this right," Victoria said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Not just apologize, actually make it right." "Then you will," Linda said, "but not tonight. Tonight belongs to Sarah and Dave. Tonight, you go home and figure out who you want to be tomorrow." Victoria nodded, understanding the wisdom in Linda's words. She'd already disrupted this celebration enough with her confession. The work of redemption would begin in the quiet moments, in the private choices that would determine whether her public admission of failure marked an ending or a beginning. As she prepared to leave the study, Bob called her name. "Mrs. Sterling?" "Victoria." The use of her first name felt significant, a small gesture of recognition that she was a person worthy of dignity despite her failures. Real change is like physical therapy after an injury. It's painful, it's slow, and some days you'll want to quit. But if you stick with it, you might discover that what you thought was broken can actually become stronger than it was before. Victoria left the Ashworth estate that night with her career in ruins, her relationship with her daughter shattered, and her carefully constructed social identity lying in pieces around her feet. But for the first time in years, she also left with something she'd forgotten existed, hope that redemption might be possible, and the knowledge that genuine strength came not from excluding others, but from having the courage to include them. The work of rebuilding would start tomorrow, Tonight, she would sit with the wreckage of her old life and prepare to construct something better from its remains. 6 months later, Victoria Sterling stood in the modest conference room of the Veterans Community Center in downtown Pittsburgh, her hands steady as she reviewed the wedding proposal spread across the folding table. The fluorescent lighting was harsh compared to the crystal chandeliers of the Ashworth estate, and the metal chairs bore no resemblance to the Italian leather furniture of her former office. But for the first time in years, Victoria felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez wants the ceremony to reflect both his Mexican heritage and his service in the Marine Corps, she explained to Colonel Patricia Morrison, who sat across from her reviewing the timeline. His fiancée Maria has been researching military wedding traditions, and they'd like to incorporate the sword arch if possible. Patricia nodded approvingly. Miguel's a good man. Served 3 tours in Afghanistan before his injury. His unit would be honored to participate. She looked up from the papers, studying Victoria with the same assessing gaze she'd used 6 months ago at Sarah's wedding. You've learned a lot in a short time. Victoria's smile was genuine, but tinged with the humility that had replaced her former arrogance. I had excellent teachers. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. The morning after Sarah's wedding, Victoria had awakened in her Maplewood apartment to 17 missed calls from potential clients cancelling their contracts, 3 resignation emails from her remaining staff, and a text from Emma that simply read, "I need time to think." The elegant life she'd spent years constructing had crumbled in a single evening, but rather than attempting to rebuild the same facade, Victoria had made a different choice. Her first step had been a phone call to Bob Henderson, asking if she could volunteer at the VA hospital where Emma worked. Bob's initial surprise had given way to cautious approval, and within a week, Victoria found herself reading to blind veterans, helping with paperwork for disability claims, and slowly beginning to understand the depth of sacrifice she'd spent years dismissing. The work was humbling. These weren't the wealthy clients who had previously validated her sense of worth. They were men and women who had given pieces of themselves in service to their country and now struggled with bureaucracy, chronic pain, and a civilian world that often failed to understand their needs. Victoria quickly learned that her expensive clothes and polished demeanor meant nothing here. What mattered was showing up consistently, listening without judgment, and finding small ways to make difficult days more bearable. Emma had been the hardest part of Victoria's journey toward redemption. Their first conversation after the wedding had been devastating. Her daughter's disappointment so complete that Victoria had left the coffee shop in tears. But Emma had inherited Michael's fundamental decency along with Victoria's stubbornness, and slowly, painfully, they had begun to rebuild trust. "Mom, I don't understand how you became someone who could hurt people like that," Emma had said during one of their monthly phone calls, her voice heavy with the confusion of a 16-year-old trying to reconcile the mother she'd loved with the woman she'd witnessed at the wedding. "I don't understand it either," Victoria had replied honestly. "I think I got so afraid of being seen as not good enough that I started believing other people weren't good enough either. It was easier than admitting I was insecure." The conversation had lasted 3 hours, with Victoria answering every difficult question Emma posed about her choices, her values, and her commitment to change. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Michael had been surprisingly supportive throughout Victoria's transformation. When she'd called to tell him about her decision to volunteer at the VA hospital, he'd listened without commentary. When she'd explained her plan to restructure her business around serving military families, he'd offered practical advice about marketing to working-class clients. Their relationship would never again be romantic, but they were slowly building something better, a friendship based on mutual respect and shared concern for their daughter. "The Rodriguez wedding will be different from what you're used to," Patricia continued, bringing Victoria's attention back to the present. Miguel's family doesn't have much money, but they're determined to make this special. The ceremony will be at St. Anthony's. It's not exactly the Ashworth estate. Victoria looked at the photos Miguel had provided. A simple church in a working-class neighborhood, a community center reception hall with industrial carpeting and acoustic tile ceilings. 6 months ago, she would have seen only limitations. Now she saw possibilities. St. Anthony's has beautiful stained glass, she observed, and if we time the ceremony for late afternoon, the light will be perfect for photos. The community center has good acoustics. We could set up a small string quartet in the corner. Miguel mentioned his unit nickname was Lightning. We could incorporate that into the decorations without it being too military for Maria's family. Patricia's expression warmed. You really have changed. The transformation in Victoria's business model had been as dramatic as her personal growth. She'd sold her Maplewood office and moved operations to a smaller space in a diverse neighborhood 20 minutes away. Her new client base consisted primarily of military families, first responders, and other service members who valued tradition and meaning over expensive displays of wealth. Her first military wedding after Sarah's had been terrifying. The bride was an army medic, the groom a police officer, and their combined budget was less than Victoria used to spend on floral arrangements. But as she watched their families come together to celebrate love, forged through shared understanding of service and sacrifice, Victoria had felt something she'd never experienced in her high society events. Genuine joy at being part of something meaningful. Word spread quickly through the military community. Veterans recommended Victoria to other veterans, not because she offered luxury, but because she understood the importance of honoring service traditions. She learned the significance of different military colors, the proper protocols for flag, ceremonies, the weight of presenting medals to fallen soldiers' families at memorial services. Her reputation in Maplewood's elite circles was permanently damaged, but Victoria discovered she didn't miss the constant pressure to impress clients who valued her only for her ability to display their wealth. Her new clients appreciated her attention to detail and growing knowledge of military traditions. They trusted her to honor their values rather than replace them with generic elegance. There's something else we need to discuss, Patricia said, her tone becoming more serious. Colonel Morrison has a proposal for you. Victoria looked up from her notes, curious. The base is hosting a memorial service next month for soldiers killed in a helicopter crash in Syria. The families have requested a civilian coordinator to help with the reception afterward, someone who understands both military protocol and event planning. It's not a paying job, but I'll do it, Victoria said immediately. Whatever they need. Patricia smiled. I thought you might say that. There's one more thing. One of the families specifically requested you. Sergeant First Class David, Jen's widow, heard about your work from the Rodriguez family. She said she wanted someone who understood what it meant to honor a soldier's memory properly. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. 6 months ago, her reputation had been built on exclusivity and aesthetic perfection. Now it was being rebuilt on respect, understanding, and genuine service to families facing the worst moments of their lives. I'm honored, she said quietly. After Patricia left, Victoria remained in the conference room, looking out the window at the parking lot where military families came and went, seeking services and support from the community center. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Saw the article about your memorial service work in the base newsletter. Dad showed it to me. I'm proud of you, Mom. It was the first time Emma had said those words since the wedding, and Victoria had to sit down as the weight of them hit her. Redemption, she was learning, came in small moments of recognition rather than grand gestures. Her phone rang, and Michael's name appeared on the screen. Hey, she answered, her voice still thick with emotion from Emma's text. Hey yourself, you okay? You sound like you've been crying." "Good tears," Victoria assured him. Emma texted. "She said she's proud of me." Michael's chuckle was warm. "She's been working up to that for weeks. She wanted to make sure you were really changing, not just going through the motions." "I don't blame her for being cautious. I have a lot to make up for." "Yes, you do, but you're doing the work, Vic. That matters." They talked for a few more minutes about Emma's upcoming school play and Michael's promotion to shop supervisor at the garage. Their conversations had become easier over the months, stripped of the tension that had defined their marriage's final years. They were better as friends than they'd ever been as spouses, united in their love for Emma and their cautious hope for Victoria's continued growth. That evening, Victoria drove to the small apartment she'd rented after selling her Maplewood condo. The neighborhood was modest but safe, populated by working families, young professionals, and elderly retirees who had earned their peace through decades of honest work. Her neighbors included a retired firefighter, a nurse who worked night shifts at the county hospital, and a young military wife whose husband was deployed overseas. Victoria had volunteered to babysit for the military wife when she needed to. Work late, an offer that had been met with initial suspicion but eventual gratitude. These small acts of service had become the foundation of Victoria's new life, not grand gestures designed to impress, but quiet consistency that built trust over time. Her apartment was simply furnished, most of the expensive pieces from her previous life sold to establish a fund for pro bono wedding services for military families who couldn't afford even her reduced rates. The walls displayed photos from the weddings she'd coordinated over the past 6 months, not the professionally styled shots that had decorated her former office, but candid moments of joy that captured the genuine emotion of each celebration. Victoria sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, reviewing her notes for the Rodriguez wedding, and thinking about how much her definition of success had changed. 6 months ago, success meant social status, expensive clients, and recognition from Maplewood's elite. Now it meant Miguel Rodriguez's shy smile when she'd suggested incorporating his military unit's traditions into his ceremony, or the grateful tears of a Gold Star mother whose son's memorial service had honored his memory with the dignity he deserved. Her phone buzzed with a message from Bob Henderson. "Saw the newsletter article about your memorial work. Linda and I are proud of how far you've come. Sarah's first anniversary is coming up. Would you be interested in coordinating a small celebration? Nothing fancy, just family and close friends." Victoria stared at the message for a long moment, overwhelmed by the grace of the invitation. Bob and Linda had every reason to want nothing to do with her, yet they continued to offer opportunities for redemption and inclusion. Their example of forgiveness without forgetting had become one of her guiding principles. She typed back, "I would be honored. Thank you for trusting me with such an important celebration." The response came quickly. "Trust is earned through consistency. You've been earning it every day for 6 months." Victoria closed her laptop and walked to her living room window, looking out at the modest street where she'd built her new life. The neighborhood lacked the prestige of Maplewood, but it had something more valuable: authenticity. Her neighbors were teachers, mechanics, nurses, retirees, and young families building their futures through hard work rather than inherited wealth. They judged her by her actions rather than her address, and they'd welcomed her when she'd proven herself worthy of inclusion. The journey from arrogance to humility had been painful, requiring her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and the values she'd embraced in her climb towards social status. She'd lost her daughter's unquestioning admiration, her marriage, her prestigious client base, and her carefully constructed identity as Maplewood's premier wedding planner. But in return, She'd gained something infinitely more valuable, the respect of people whose opinions were based on character rather than bank accounts, work that provided genuine meaning rather than just profit, and relationships built on mutual service rather than mutual exploitation. Victoria Sterling was no longer the woman who had tried to erase a wounded veteran's dignity from his daughter's wedding. She was becoming someone better. Someone who understood that true honor came not from excluding others, but from finding ways to lift them up. The transformation was ongoing, requiring daily choices to serve rather than be served, to include rather than exclude, to build others up rather than tear them down. As she prepared for bed, Victoria thought about the memorial service she would coordinate next month, the Rodriguez wedding that would celebrate love strengthened by service, and the small anniversary party that would mark not just Sarah and Dave's first year of marriage, but her own first year of genuine redemption. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that change was possible, that people could learn from their mistakes and become better versions of themselves. Tonight, she would rest in the knowledge that honor, once lost, could be slowly, carefully rebuilt, one act of genuine service at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Of all the people she'd wronged tonight, he was the one whose presence felt most unbearable. She started to rise, ready to flee again, but something in his calm demeanor stopped her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity she'd witnessed throughout their interactions, the dignity she'd tried so hard to diminish. Victoria nodded mutely, unsure of her voice. Bob positioned his wheelchair across from her chair, his movements economical and practiced. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the distant sounds of the continuing reception filtering through. The study's closed door. "That took courage," he said finally. Victoria's laugh was bitter, broken. "Courage. I destroyed my relationship with my daughter, humiliated myself publicly, and probably ended my career. If that's courage, it's the stupidest kind." "Sometimes the stupidest kind is the only kind that matters," Bob replied. "I've seen real courage, Mrs. Sterling. On battlefields, in hospital rooms, in the quiet moments when someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it costs them everything. What you did out there, that was real courage." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She'd been holding back since Emma ran from the ballroom. "She'll never forgive me. My daughter. She volunteers with veterans because she believes in service and sacrifice, and she just learned that her mother is everything she stands against." Bob was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "You know what I learned in 23 years of military service? That the worst enemy isn't the one shooting at you, it's the one inside your own head, telling you that you're not good enough, that you don't deserve respect, that you have to prove your worth by putting others down." Victoria looked up at him, surprised by the turn in conversation. "I fought that enemy for years," Bob continued. "Even before the IED, even before the injury that ended my career. I came from nothing. Dirt poor family in Tennessee, father who drank too much, mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. When I joined the army, I felt like I had to prove I belonged there. Had to show everyone I was as good as the college boys, as good as the officers who came from military families." He paused, his gaze distant with memory. "Took me too long to learn that real strength doesn't come from proving you're better than someone else. It comes from lifting others up, from recognizing that everyone's fighting battles you can't see." Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her expensive makeup probably ruined, beyond repair. "I don't know how to come back from this. I don't know how to face Emma, how to look at myself in the mirror, how to—" "One day at a time," Bob said simply. "One choice at a time. That's how any of us do it." The study door opened again, and Linda Henderson appeared. her face showing the same serene strength Victoria had witnessed throughout their interactions. "There you are," she said to her husband, then looked at Victoria with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly warm, simply assessing. "I should go," Victoria said, starting to rise again. "Sit down," Linda said, not unkindly but with the authority of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations. "We need to talk." Victoria sank back into the chair, feeling like a child, called to account for bad behavior. Linda pulled up another chair, creating a small circle in the study. "My husband is a generous man," she began. "Too generous sometimes. He sees the best in people even when they don't deserve it." Victoria winced, but Linda continued. "I'm more practical. I've had to be. 25 years as a military spouse teaches you to spot genuine character versus pretty words. And what I saw tonight was someone finally choosing to be genuine after years of pretty words. But the damage was already done," Linda interrupted, "to your daughter, to your relationship with your ex-husband, to your own soul. What you did tonight wasn't damage, it was surgery, painful but necessary."